Hello and welcome to Times of Engagement, where we try to throw a little light on key political terms. I'm James Butler, and this week I'll be talking about Europe. And when people talk about Europe, generally these days, certainly in political debate, they tend to mean the EU, although there are other massive institutions that cover the whole of the geographic continent. Important here, of course, is the Council of Europe, which is a widespread body which administers human rights. But generally, and particularly at the moment with the EU debate going on, people mean the EU, the European Union. So what is the EU? Unlike many of the terms that we discuss, the meaning of the EU, the meaning of Europe, doesn't really change over time. But like many things in politics, the way that you understand it, the way that you think about it, depends on the story that you're told and that you understand about it. And the popular story here, the really popular story, is the one that is put out by the EU. It's on all the official web pages, and it runs a little bit like this. And this is the official story. It's a really close focus on the origins, the political origins of the EU. It begins with a group of forward-thinking diplomats and largely unelected politicians at the end of World War II. And they think the wars that have racked the European continent cannot be allowed to happen again. How do you do this? Well, in 1950, they issue something called the Schuman Declaration, which says we're going to achieve world peace. That's our aim. And we're going to do it initially by pooling coal and steel production from the fields and the borders between Germany and France. And this happens. This is the origin of something called the European Coal and Steel Community, which will eventually become the Economic Community, and which will eventually become the EU as we know it today. And the idea here is that very early on, these diplomats write in to the production of this initial community the institutions that become the governing institutions of the European Union, particularly its court and its parliament, its high authority. And essentially the idea is that from then on, the thing just expands quite peacefully, and all these European nations get bound together in this happy, joyful, free trade based political community. So that's the official story. And one of the things it tells us that's true is that the EU as it exists today really was the creation of bureaucrats. It was the creation of bureaucrats who were very fearful of national strife, who didn't trust nationalist politics. Good reason after World War II. They also didn't trust the popular will very much. They didn't really trust the peoples of Europe to democratically decide things, and that's been a problem with the EU right to the present day. But let's ask another question. What happens if you widen the picture a bit? If you go beyond that official story? And one way to do that is to start looking at the economics of the case. Immediately after World War II, domestic governments are looking at huge problems. Problems of wrecked economies and massive problems of domestic political legitimacy. Remember, these governments had sent many of their working class into war, and many of them had died. So the early methods of coal and steel production, and eventually the removal of trade barriers, international tariffs, as well as equalization of labour markets, these are really, really important to a huge explosion in international trade and massive domestic growth rates. And these things allow these governments to reach social democratic settlements with their workers. They fund projects like council housing, like investment in national health services. So that's really essential to restoring that sense of legitimacy. And one of the things that happens here is that these states working together, removing barriers and tariffs to trade, allowing coordination across states of labour markets, really starts to smooth the way for a globalising capitalist economy. This is really the big second phase of globalisation. You could say the first phase happens in the 19th century with the arrival of, say, railways and stuff like that. It's massive increase in globalisation after World War II. And so you have huge spikes in growth rates and massive international trade. So on the one hand, capital here globalizes, but on the other hand, these governments attempt to protect domestic constituencies that are of electoral importance. And this is true with a lot of these original economies, like France or Italy, where 40% or so of their workers were in agriculture. This is where we see the origins of things like the common agricultural policy. That's a huge part of the EU right up until the present day. You see Expansion of the economic community, huge expansion. This is probably, in fact, the EU's most successful period. However, we see, as we know, serious recession in the 1970s, going on into the 80s, where these regimes no longer quite work in the way that they used to. And this is the point where the left in Europe finds it very, very difficult to reach a settlement, whereas the right know exactly what they're doing. This is the high point of the British influence in Europe, in the Single European Act of 1986 and in the Treaty of Maastricht, which was written in 1991. Very important here, of course, is the role of Margaret Thatcher. So here we see some big changes to the direction of Europe. Under the influence of Thatcher, we see pro-market orientation really written into the DNA of what the EU becomes. And here we see, over the course of the EU's expansion, massive changes in the way that states orient their economic policy. Economic policy begins to be lifted out of the hands of individual states, while governments are left to deal with the consequences. This is a really important point about the development of the EU. The other thing here is what ceases to happen. And what ceases to happen is a primary concern about protecting those domestic constituency. That really starts to evaporate by the time of the Maastricht Treaty. One of the things that becomes really clear when you look at the history of the EU is the role of things we call exogenous shocks to its political makeup. And what's essential here is that these shocks are often economic, but sometimes they're geopolitical. So for instance, one of the things that really kicks the Treaty of Rome, one of the really initial founding treaties of what becomes the European Union, into gear is the Suez Crisis. One of the more conventional economic shocks is the collapse of Bretton Woods, the end of the gold standard. So this geopolitical matter is really important early on. It's why de Gaulle doesn't want Britain to join the economic community. He thinks that Britain will be a Trojan horse for US interests in the possible emergence of Europe as a third force between Moscow and Washington. In fact, this doesn't really matter anyway, because pretty rapidly the EU, or what becomes the EU, its foreign policy is largely subducted into NATO. These exogenous shocks are really essential, and one of the really major ones and one of the really major tensions in the EU today is the consequence of the end of the Soviet Union. After the end of the Soviet Union, you have all of these ex-Comecon, communist economy, countries coming into the EU. You have the reunification of Germany, and this is really essential to changing the economic makeup of the European Union. And what results here is huge German economic dominance, a reliance on cheap labour from the East, as well as really serious differences in the way that the economies within the European Union work. Now, in times of profit, in times of boom, that's okay. But after the global financial crisis, another exogenous shock, we see those stress lines really beginning to form across Europe. And it's a problem that isn't resolved right up until the present day. One of the other things to talk about here, something I think is really essential to understanding the way in which the EU evolved and the way in which it deals with foreign trade treaties, the way it deals with economic outsourcing and work abroad, is to understand that right at the beginning, right at its foundation, right when those diplomats were sitting down and thinking about the ECSC and the institutions that would result from it, they were thinking about Africa. They were thinking very clearly that Europe had huge colonial power, but what it didn't have was raw materials. So how does Europe retain its sort of economic eminence? How does it retain that relationship to Africa, which has been so exploitative for so long, which has been rubber, bauxite, diamonds, platinum, and of course human labour? It does it through Eurafrica initiatives. It does it through soft power, through trade. One of the most far-sighted things that these diplomats did, one of the things they really knew, was that trade was going to be the vector, the method of a kind of new colonialism. And that stuff, that relationship between Europe and between Africa, that relationship between Europe and the rest of the world, plays out now at Europe's borders. This is the reason that Europe's borders are so hard. This is the reason that Frontex, the European police force, the agency that coordinates border policing, is so violent. This is the reason that Europe has been happy to see countless thousands wash up dead on its shores. Some of the tensions in these stories, right from the narrow one all the way out to the widest perspective, are what pattern political tensions in Europe today between inside and outside, between economic technocracy and popular democracy, between globalized capital and national workers. And these things, if you want to democratize Europe, as some people do, all of these things are things you have to take notice of. And if you want to leave Europe, if you think, let's leave this all behind, well, these are questions you're going to face as well. I hope that's been helpful. This has been Terms of Engagement, and this has been part of our Europe Week here on Novara, where we're bringing you content across the board relating to Europe, to the EU, and to the debate. Thanks for watching.